Hello, this section is entitled Deploying an Application that Receives Google Cloud Events. For example, Cloud Pub Sub, blah, blah, blah. This time we're looking at App Engine Flexible Environment. The reason why we went with Flexible Environment as our first example, because if you recall in our previous example that we ran from our workstation, that code had to be continuously running, right? Because it was using the pull method for the subscriber to pull messages off of the subscription. So of the examples of the environments that we coded in previously, the only one that did not scale to zero by essentially, actually flexible environment, you cannot scale to zero, right? So basically that means you always have an instance running, which means you always have an instance pulling messages out of the subscription. So that the flexible environment most closely resembles what we did with our last example, bottom line. So before we get into thinking about coding this in App Engine flexible environment, we have to step back for a second, talk about service accounts. So in the previous examples of hello worlds that we've written for the various compute environments, we didn't have to interact with any of the Google APIs, right? They were just basically listening on a port and returning hello, hello world. So we didn't have to worry about whether or not how that, that process was going to communicate to Google to do something. In this case, we have to set up a subscription where this, wherever this code's running, right, has the ability to talk to that subscription to pull down data. And when we did it from our workstation, we just relied on the fact that our user accounts were essentially owners of the project, so it worked, right? We didn't have to think about it. In this case, this code is running on a compute somewhere, and how do we assign or associate some credentials so it has now rights to talk to Cloud Pub Sub, bottom line. And the way Google, and this is kind of probably a topic we'll come back to in more detail later, but this is about identity access management again. And there's something called service accounts, and essentially they're just like a user account, except for users don't log into them. They're actually used by compute instances or compute operations within Google Cloud, and you just grant rights to that service account as opposed to a human, right? And if you look at App Engine, so App Engine is designed so that when you install App Engine, it actually creates a service account for you that has pretty broad rights in your project, and all services that you create under App Engine all use that same service account. So I think we'll just look at that real quick, just so we can see that in action. Compute Engine, no, Identity Access Management. So there's service accounts. And one of the service accounts that was created for you is this first one, training main. So this is your project at appspot.gservicesaccount.com. So this got created for you, and that account then has certain rights. And you can see here, if I can find it, here it is right here, training main, it has editor. And if you remember, editor is a pretty wide ranging access, right? It's one of the basic roles, and it basically gives you pretty much almost everything the owner does, except for you can't really change security. Okay, so bottom line, this code, whatever code we run in our App Engine, will basically act as if it was training main, and it basically can do anything it needs, which includes subscribing to the subscription. Okay. I think at this point we just want to look at the code and then see it in action. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to the code, right? Now this code here, I took essentially, I'm not going through it line by line, but I created a new service called events. And this code here is essentially kind of a mashup between the flexible environment example I did earlier and the subscriber example I did in the last video. And one main difference though is in terms of the mashup, I'm not actually running Express here. So this is different than the previous flexible example in the sense that this actually doesn't run a web service, right? It's not listening for traffic. It's just running basically the Cloud Pub Sub code. So that's one big difference. But in that case, it's more like the example we did in the last video. I did have to add the engine node, I believe, and I had to add the module type. And otherwise, it's pretty much a lot like the flexible environment. The thing about the flexible environment that got carried over is the app.yaml. Remember, right? I just changed the name events. Otherwise, it's basically Node.js environment flex. And to run it, all I got to do is gcloud app deploy. It's going to ask you, do you want to deploy it? You say yes. I'm going to pause the video because it takes about a minute. So let me pause the video. Okay, it started. So again, we can validate that it's running, not so much by running the web browser anymore because right, this doesn't have a web browser, it doesn't serve up web pages, but we can go to App Engine, Services, let's see, there's events, versions, let's change to events. We should see 2 instances running, and if I go under instances, under events, I should see that there's 2 events. Yeah, 2 of them are running. Now, one thing is interesting here that I just observed, that it says the health status check is healthy, but this, which is not entirely true because the configuration, I looked at it, we don't provide a path, so it basically should not be enabled readiness checks or health checks, but it does say it's healthy. But again, we didn't serve up any web endpoints, so it couldn't have checked anything. So I think it just means that it hasn't crashed, essentially. So the process is still running, I think is how I interpret that. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is actually see one of these actually processing one of the events out of the subscription. So the way we can do that is if I go to the publisher, right, and if I just run npm run start, that should be able to create a message, publish it to the topic then gets to the subscription, and then we have 2 instances of the service running, so one of them should have picked it up. If I go under, I believe, under services, under events, and look at the logs, see if this is zoomed in far enough. Let me look in the last 30 seconds. And there, so there it is. So there, 11, yeah, so this happened just a minute ago. You can see that we received the message. This is 11:41. You can see that that wasn't what I was looking for. That's this event right here. So we matched up the events. So one of them did pick it up. There was only one message, right? Because even though we have 2 different instances running, it will automatically, only one of them will pick it up. And interesting enough, just in terms of scaling, the default behavior of, let's see if I can get to it. No, I won't. Well, if you look, I'll do it. If you look under App Engine, under versions for this event, and you can look at the config, even though we didn't specify it specifically, you can see that there's automatically, its default behavior is to automatically scale. So that's why we have the 2 instances, and it can go up to 20 instances, and it's targeting on, basically if one of these uses up half of their CPU, then it'll scale up. So this should be already configured to sort of behave properly, right? So what will happen is, let's say we start pushing a lot of instances to this queue, right? Or into this subscription. If any one of the 2 instances gets busy enough, right, then it realizes that the CPU utilization is too high, it's going to bring up another 3rd or 4th, whatnot. So this is already kind of configured out of the box to scale properly for this kind of service. Okay, I think that's all we're going to cover. Oh, I guess one thing that we saw in the logs, just FYI, Yeah, it does interesting show a lot of readiness checks and liveness checks being successful. But again, this service, if I try to actually go to the events URL, it basically will say that, hey, there's nothing there. And that's entirely expected because we're not actually providing any, it's trying to go to the, basically trying to go to the service, and the service is like saying, I'm not there, essentially. So that's expected, just unusual to see the health checks sort of behaving like they're actually running. Okay, that's it for the video.